to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hi, I'm Dana Torst, and welcome to another episode of the Truth in My Days radio program. Today, I'm here with John Torst and Jason Chan as they discuss the important topic of creation and evolution. We are continuing from the previous episode. We hope you enjoy.
Creation evolution. We're looking at whether the theory of evolution is possible even from a purely scientific point of view. To recap at this point, it's helpful to do a recap every once in a while. We saw 4 essential steps for evolution to happen. The first of these would be that simple chemicals such as carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, and so on, must spontaneously self-assemble, come together, into complex, ordered organic molecules, proteins, DNA, and so forth. And then these complex organic molecules have to then self-assemble into a cell structure. And we looked at the laws of science, specifically the second law of thermodynamics, and saw that this is impossible. Now, the second law of thermodynamics may sound complex, but in reality, it's something that we all understand. It simply says that in nature, in natural processes, everything falls apart, everything decays as time goes on. Things don't go in the opposite order. If you have a house, eventually it will fall apart into a pile of rubble, but a pile of rubble will never spontaneously turn into an ordered house. Firewood burns into ash. Ash cannot be burned back into firewood. People get older. They don't get younger. This, as we saw, is the most certain law of all of science, and it prevents these 2 steps, which means the theory of evolution, certainly atheistic evolution, is already impossible. So we'll continue on from here, and we look at the next of the 4 essential steps. We looked at the first 2. The third one is, if we ignore the problems with creating the cell structure, the next problem is it's not alive, and it will have to come to life. Is it possible for a cell structure that's non-living to come to life? What would you think?
So, no, something that isn't alive isn't able to bring something else into life. I think this is called the law of biogenesis.
Indeed. For a long time, people did believe that life could come about spontaneously. It's what they called spontaneous generation. And the reason they thought that is if you left a piece of meat rotting out, eventually you're going to find little bugs developing inside the meat. And they thought that the dead meat had just given rise to these bugs. Some wonderful experimental work done mainly by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century showed that, in fact, spontaneous generation doesn't happen. And he had various experiments. An obvious one on the rotting meat is he put out a piece of rotting meat, and then he put out another piece of rotting meat in a sealed container, cut off from everything. And sure enough, the meat that was just left open had these little bugs developing, and the meat that was cut off in the environment didn't. And they eventually discovered that these bugs were actually hatching fly eggs. Flies would come and deposit their eggs on the meat, and they would then grow into these maggots. These were the little bugs. And in fact, without the flies doing that, you wouldn't get these bugs. So this and other experiments from Pasteur led to what was called the law of biogenesis, enunciated in 1864, which says that only life can give rise to life. Life never comes from non-living matter.
Yeah, sorry, John. Before we continue any further, could we define what life is?
We really can't, actually, because scientists say that life is like art. You can't define it, you just know it when it is. So what they do is they tend to talk about the characteristics of life. It runs metabolic processes, it reproduces, right. There's growth generally. So a constellation of characteristics that define life or describe life is actually better. Okay. But nobody can certainly give you an actual definition of life. But as with art, they can tell when something is alive, something isn't. Okay? Something like a virus, they may say, well, a virus can't exist on its own. So there's a question there. But Now, the reality is, in general, we know. Certainly when we're talking about animals, we're talking about people, we know what's alive, what's not. For example, we could do this simple experiment. Take a frog. Do not try this at home, folks. It's just an illustration. Take a frog, take a blender, insert frog into blender, push the cream button, and guess what you're going to get? You're going to get like frog soup. Inside this frog soup, you have all of those complex organic molecules that you need. You have your proteins, your DNA, your RNA, your lipids, all of that. You don't have to worry about where these come from. They're all there. So make it come to life. Make something come to life out of it. Well, you can't do it. Or even roadkill. You come across a squished raccoon on the road. An hour ago was alive. Make it come back to life. I mean, everything is there. Even the structures are in place. You can't do it. And we know that. So this is the law of biogenesis. And it is a law of science like any other law. And laws tell you what always happens in the same way and under the circumstances, and it's never violated. And this has become a big problem for evolutionists. They kind of wish that the law of biogenesis had never been discovered. And they can actually become very much intellectually dishonest on this. When you bring up the law of biogenesis, the evolutionists will say, well, all that Pasteur did was disprove spontaneous generation. And we're looking for abiogenesis, life coming from non-life, and that's our research is abiogenesis, as if you make up a term and that makes it happen. The problem with this is the law of biogenesis tells you that life only comes from life. Life cannot come from non-living matter. It doesn't apply only to spontaneous generation. There's the proverbial story of Newton discovering the law of gravity when an apple fell out of a tree and landed on his head, and that got him to thinking about this. So what the evolutionists now are doing with the law of biogenesis would be like saying, wow, the law of gravity only applies to apples falling out of trees. It's not an honest way to do science. And to talk about we're doing research into abiogenesis means nothing. It's because it can't be done. We already have the law of science for that. Furthermore, as we talked about when we discussed how science operates, you do the experiment, you try to disprove something, you do it 1,000 times, it's never violated, 2,000 times, it's never violated. By inductive logic, you should conclude that this is the law. It's never going to be violated. That's how science works. Have scientists been working on abiogenesis, on trying to bring life out of non-living matter? Certainly they have. They've done thousands of experiments, trying under the best possible laboratory conditions to make it happen. And every single time they failed. So by the proper scientific method, they should reconclude the law of biogenesis. It can't happen. But they need it for evolution to work. They need it to drive God out, so they're going to insist we're still looking. This is not proper science, folks.
Yeah, we've mentioned before that if theory violates a law, then we discard it.
Has to go. Now, what you'll often see in the textbooks or hear about in the classroom is what they call the Yuri Miller experiment. Have you heard of that?
Just briefly. Can you tell us more about it?
The Yuri Miller experiment was an experiment into abiogenesis done by two researchers, Harold Yuri and Stanley Miller, back in 1953. And what they did here was put together an elaborate set of apparatus that had one glass ball with water in it, the so-called oceanic compartment, and they put a heater under it, a Bunsen burner, so that would heat the water and boil it. The water vapor then went up through a glass tube and into another glass ball, and this was called the atmospheric compartment. So these two balls were supposed to represent the ocean and then the atmosphere of the early Earth. Within the atmospheric compartment, they put in gases, the kind that they thought would have been in the atmosphere of the early Earth. So nitrogen gas, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, ammonia, hydrogen gas. And into this, they now put the water vapor from the oceanic compartment and that little electrodes to make sparks. And they were trying to create life because they believed that this is how life came about on early Earth. And so they would spark these, and out would come the products from the atmospheric compartment and nothing. What they did then is they put in a cold water trap. They put in something to instantly cool the products. And now they found a few simple amino acids coming out of it. These would have broken down instantly, except that they were cooled down. So what this whole experiment gave them were a few simple amino acids, not even a simple protein. Remember, this doesn't happen, not even one simple protein. And yet they said, see, this explains how life came about on early Earth. Now, do you think you could identify a few problems with this claim?
Yeah, well, the first thing would be, what would this cold water, where would you be able to find it in the early Earth?
Yeah, would there be anything that corresponds to this cold water trap? No, there isn't, so that's one. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Next is, as you mentioned, these are very simple amino acids, nothing resembling proteins. Another thing is, can all of these organic compounds have been at the right concentration for this to happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Does this set of organic compounds or these gases in the early atmosphere, would they have been there in those concentrations? In fact, they wouldn't have been there at all. The one that they've left out here is oxygen. And the problem with oxygen is it oxidizes things. So you wouldn't possibly get even these simple amino acids. Anything that came out would instantly be oxidized. So the early models claimed that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere of the early Earth. That didn't develop until green plants came along. But now our studies have shown, by analyzing the components in the earliest structures of the Earth, that in fact oxygen was there from the beginning. So this is a non-starter. Even their atmospheric compartment, we know that the earliest atmosphere was not like that. So it's game over. And then the other obvious problem is you might get a few simple amino acids, but they're not alive. This is supposed to show how life came about. And they will show you in the textbooks and the kids' books, they will show you this. They might mention that, this is just about organic compounds, but then they will say, well, okay, and then they came to life. And that's just absolute nonsense. And the fact that they will continue putting forth the Yuri Miller experiment, although they know it's not accurate and it doesn't explain the origin of life, but this is the one they're always putting forth when they're teaching evolution, origin of life in the classroom. It tells you something. It tells you something about whether they really have answers or not. They don't. They're just extremely desperate here to try to find something. But you always find that. Here's one common in their popular book for children called Life. It says, investigate the origins of life and find out how living things survive. And you go inside the book, and how did life begin? Well, you'll have your picture of the Yuri Miller experiment there. And the claims that, we just really don't know. We don't know where it really came from. But we'll find out. And it gets just extremely, extremely desperate.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.